Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons, Sarah Turner. It's Not Just In Your Head is hosted by psychotherapist Dr. Harriet Frudd, substance use disorder counsellor Eco Hero, and myself, the editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So, if you can afford to give, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making this show. However, if you can't, then please leave a review on your podcast platform of choice, tell your friends about us, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, or YouTube. Also, a massive thank you to Elle for organising our monthly reading groups and episode discussions, which you, dear listener, can join too. Just head over to our Eventbrite page. The link is in the show notes.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Masculinity has been an issue that has pervaded a lot of media conversation, both in the mainstream and on the left, for quite some time. And since our guest today has studied this very topic in a developing world setting, I think it would be kind of a really interesting thing to start with how it's similar and different in another country, and kind of expand the discussion there to the United States.
William, I don't know if you wanted to sort of, if you had like a blurb, some sort of intro thing.
Oh, sure. Well, sure. Just to talk a little bit about myself, I've listened to your show a bit. I've met Ikoi, and I love the topic. And I've seen that you also had FD Signifier and some other folks on talking about masculinity. So you've already, covered this topic to some extent. In my research, I like to point out that I studied 3 support groups and also 3 churches when I was living in northern Costa Rica for a couple of years. Those 24 months were actually spread out over about a decade, and during that time, I shifted my focus from a more explicitly political focus, looking at religion and politics in Costa Rica through the lens of these different churches, a Catholic, an Adventist, and an evangelical church, and shifting to looking at gender in the family, because, one of the things that anthropologists will tell you a lot is that we tend to shift towards whatever our informants want to talk about and seems more locally relevant. So we often come with a set of questions, and then we watch our informants sort of change those questions. And in the process, I just saw that it was clear that family, and in particular machismo as a topic, was just a centerpiece at most churches, which was very interesting because, as many of you may already know, 2/3 of many churches are female, but this is no less true, if anything more true, in Latin America. So you're watching organizations often headed by men, but where most of the attendees are women, focusing on men and masculinity in this vocal way. And I think that even though in our culture, the discussion around toxic masculinity is certainly not new, maybe the term is new, there is a power in having a term like machismo itself, not as old as people would think, but a term that lets you sort of name a problem in this way. And so it was interesting to me to watch the extent to which people are focused on this. When I initially was single and then later married in my research, I was able to see, different social environments and different attitudes that people had towards my being married or unmarried. And one of the things that pushed me onto this track was hearing at a lot of these churches, these interviews where I talk with people, and they had a long list of complaints about, the ways they'd been treated by men, and many of them, were obviously more than justified. So I was interested in why, whether it was truly worse than another place or this place, or whether the power of being able to talk about it and having a term ready for it was, generating conversation, whether these institutions were generating some of the conversation, and in the end, I decided to shift my focus to 3 men's support groups because as I talked with priests and pastors and, clergy, and they increasingly told me that we don't quite know what to do for men here sometimes. We love when they come, but we often try to, point them towards Alcoholics Anonymous or point them towards the 2 other men's groups I studied. There were interdenominational groups. That was one of the groups I looked at. I looked at Alcoholics Anonymous, and then I looked at a group that was facilitated by 3 to 4 psychologists helping men focus on men and masculinity. So I did a comparative study between those three and spent a year with each of those groups. So I guess, that's the end of, I won't make the blurb too long, but that's the end of, the setup of how I came to these questions. And I did a set of life history interviews. That's my basic orientation and interest, is trying to understand at least people's retrospective view on the changes that have happened in their life. And when I heard that you guys had this podcast, I started listening to some of the episodes because it's a similar set of questions you're interested in. It seems like the way that mental health, often perceived and pathologized as an individual problem, is actually so connected to cultural and social changes.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. Just as a side, what were the different attitudes that people had with you being unmarried and then married?
I was treated pretty differently, especially when my wife was present. But yeah, I think the assumption was, when I was unmarried and I went to these churches, many people joke that young people going to church, because there's also let's say an age issue in terms of who's going to what church. Many young people that are going to church are often joked about by the pastors and priests that, they're coming here to find a husband or wife, because sometimes people get a little jaded, let's say, in the dating scene. And they say, well, I'm going to, go back to church and meet some nice boy or girl, and it's going to move along for me a little bit. So, initially that was basically the way I was treated a little bit. Like, you're not married? Well, you should meet so-and-so, and you should meet so-and-so. And then when I, was married, then the question was more just like, why aren't there more kids?
Right.
Well, one of the things that I'm curious about is the violence, because and femicide, killing women, because I have noticed, you can't fail to notice in the United States that there's at least one mass murder every week. I wonder how that hypermasculinity plays out there and how you would compare it to its deadly effects here.
Yeah, well, I think what you're saying is dead on. It's definitely true in Costa Rica, and many parts of Latin America have this issue where I don't know how you measure what the right amount of murder or distribution of murder is, but it's clear that women are being murdered at much, much higher rates in some places, and often by ex-lovers or boyfriends or husbands. Or that's definitely a problem in Costa Rica, and it forms a strong part of the public discourse. If you read the newspapers, those are the kinds of things that are sensationalized in the more sensationalistic, tabloid type papers that you'll see people reading. So every day people both, not only does this happen, but people read about it and are confronted with it. It's a big part of the discourse about machismo, is domestic violence. Essentially, in some circles, machismo is equivalent to, domestic violence. I guess there's another couple of layers. One of them is that I lived in a ranching town, and throughout Latin America, ranching has a strong association with machismo because of Mexican cinema from the 30s to the 60s, and the way that sort of unified their idea of what machismo might be. And then also, what you're pointing out is true in a growing sense with Central American gangs and sort of violence against women that's sort of institutionalized there. So I guess those are the different layers that I saw. Costa Rica is increasingly becoming a drug running area. It wasn't quite as bad when I lived there, simply because Costa Rica doesn't really have an army and can't really defend against more powerful drug gangs that use the country to run drugs. So that's increasingly become a problem, and I think a bigger part of the way that people think about machismo.
What do you think is the relationship between machismo and right-wing politics? Fascistic countries are almost always misogynist. All of them that I know. Certainly the Nazis have a very developed misogynist policy. And I wonder, what is the relationship? Because I did notice that Cuba has the most advanced family policy in the world, their new, very publicly voted on family policy makes women equals, makes domestic violence a terrible crime, makes supporting women and children paramount. It's a very developed policy and is related to their leftism. I wonder, what is the relationship, do you think, between right-wing politics and machismo? Because they seem to go together.
Yes, and maybe just as much as it's true in the positive sense that you're saying, that, militaristic governments or right-wing governments, institutionalize machismo in certain ways. I think also what you're saying, the inverse is true, which is that anti-machismo, which is really the way that you hear the term, it's more often used in a pejorative sense, not in a positive sense, the way it might have been used in earlier years. So yes, I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. Costa Rica, in my particular case, is in a sort of a weird position because many of its social policies and its existence of a social welfare state would be something that you'd mostly see in countries like Uruguay or Venezuela in earlier years, where they'd invested a lot in social programs. But on the other hand, Costa Rica has fairly right-wing gender politics when it comes to abortion and IVF and reproductive rights and reproduction in general. So it's a bit of a weird mix. Yeah. With also a very strong role of the church. It's one of the 5 countries where the Catholic Church has had a strong enough role that it's been able to oppose not just abortion rights, but as I was pointing out, assisted reproductive technologies as well. So it's a weird mix there.
Do they have a movement? Like, I was really impressed that in Argentina, after many years of trying and after a huge push by the Catholic Church, they won abortion rights. Is there an abortion rights movement in Costa Rica?
Yeah, and I can, after the show, maybe post a couple of links. I'm not really an expert on this, but I did focus on abortion and contraception for my master's. There is to say, there is a movement. Women in Costa Rica and a lot of Latin America have access theoretically to birth control. I think that the problem is getting a lot better with patient confidentiality, but there was a persistent problem in Latin America where if you looked at it a certain way, women are using birth control at rates fairly similar to North America, which is kind of what I did my master's on. How do people reconcile their religious views, where the church takes a very strong stance on this, with their actual practice? And it ends up being the case, at least at the turn of that century, in the first decade, that women were more often using it to stop having children than to not start. So there was a sort of a difference in the way it was used, and younger women were still having, from 15 to 19, a very hard time getting access. And then there's also been a judicial part of it, which is that Costa Rica has been taken to court by the OAS for not allowing, fairly extreme cases where, very, very, where girls were, raped or assaulted and left pregnant and still not, given easy access to an abortion. So they've actually faced legal problems as a country, but it's one of these states that supports the Catholic Church so strongly as to basically take care of the maintenance of the major cathedrals in the country. It has a very close relationship with the church, so that's the real challenge in many ways.
Yeah, I wonder if because it's pretty alarming in some ways that what you said, that 2/3 of the church were female, but it was mostly run by guys. You're saying also that lots of women obviously complaining about men or domestic violence or all kinds of things like that. Is it what's happening in that situation? Because I can imagine if these guys are sort of installing the rules about what it is to be a family or what it is to be a man or by extension, how you should be as a woman, that there must then be a sort of internalization process where on one hand, women are probably complaining about men, but also they are have internalized a set of rules about how a man should be. So I can imagine that there's some policing that goes on that side of the population as well. So, I'm not I'm not excusing any sort of domestic violence or any shit like that. But I am sort of getting at this idea that it's only men policing men. That happens, but also certain women will police men as well. And I'm just wondering, is part of that recipe what you've explained in this sort of church situation?
I think so, yes. In the churches, I think one strong argument is that essentially what women are doing is disciplining men, in very specific ways. A lot of the churches have very strict rules about to drink at all, whereas alcoholism and wasting, much of the family budget in the form of alcohol, men going out and drinking away their entire day's pay, was very common and is very common. So the church makes demands. I've heard it described in some literature as a neo-patriarchal bargain, where the church makes a lot of demands on men's behavior and sort of takes them out of this machismo sphere where they're getting drunk. It doesn't allow them to, at least in many churches, abuse their wives physically, at least, or their children. It prescribes adultery, proscribes adultery. It makes a lot of demands on men's behavior, and in return, the argument goes, they're given certain traditional sort of rights, let's say, in the family and a place within it. And I think that, that latter point is really where my research started off from, which is that, it's very easy, and a lot of the machismo discourse does focus on all these horrible problems. But what the support groups that I studied were trying to do, which was give men a positive image of what masculinity could be, because it's one thing to say, don't do toxic masculinity, maybe, and another thing to say, here's a fully fleshed out model of positive, nurture, positive masculinity, something that's at least recognizably masculine, or at least obtainable to you as a man. It's not just totally out of your league in terms of the requirements, what you could possibly do. But that's what these groups were trying to do, which is everyone was saying machismo is bad. Everyone is complaining about these social problems, but how do we actually change men's behavior? And one of the things that's funny about the churches, but also I would say gender and development organizations in a lot of parts of the world, in India and Latin America, is that there's sometimes a tension between what Western organizations want to do, what they think is important, and what local organizations want to do. And a lot of these local organizations essentially say, our problem is men. Like, I understand if you don't want to spend the resources that you've dedicated to women and children on men, that's reasonable. But also, like, if you don't do something to change men's behavior and make them a contributing member of the family, we're not going to have enough income. We can't, be under the threat of violence of, just men running around wild. We essentially need some, more everyday control. The churches do that, but as I came to discover, they don't do it well enough to sort of even rely on themselves to achieve this. So they often funnel people towards these groups, many of which are modeled on AA loosely. That's the loose cultural model, but very few of which follow the 12-step, system. It's just that AA has been so popular in Latin America. That's really maybe important to stress. In parts of Central America, there are 3 times as many men attending AA as in North America. So it's actually more popular in many parts of Latin America than it is here. And as such, it's become the basic cultural model for how do you get men to do something like behavior reform or spirituality or something like that. It looks like a support group, essentially.
Well, what are the penalties if men transgress recommended behavior by the church? If a guy beats up his wife and kids, is there any punishment in the church or any revelation of him as a sinner in the church body, or what? Or is it just that the woman is told he was wrong and he gets away with it?
Well, I think I have to distinguish here between which churches. The Catholic Church is very well established, and they do have domestic violence programs. I don't really want to attest to the success or lack of success to those because I can't directly. On the other hand, evangelical churches and the sectarian churches like the Adventist church that I studied, what they exert is a very strong social control. Those are basically your friends now. Very often when you join one of these churches, you sort of say goodbye to your friends that are trying to get you to drink and womanize and do all this. So you sort of make a clean break with a lot of your social networks, and you form new social networks. And it's those that basically provide a lot of the soft pressure. Men get a lot of their, self-esteem and sense of value from these groups. And if they have a setback, they do have their old friends that they could fall back to, but the church will send people out usually to confront them. I know I'm describing the Costa Rican case, a weird sort of fact that I don't want to sensationalize, but in some parts of Central America, the evangelical churches have associations with the gangs, actually. And there's a weird relationship where the only way, sometimes the churches will launder money in these extreme cases. I don't want to say that's normal, but it's been known to happen. But in many more situations, the gangs will essentially allow a man to leave the gang if they join a church and keep by its rules, but the gang checks up on the guy to see if he's following the rules. And if he's not considered to be a member in good standing, they can sort of reclaim him. And that's not a situation that I faced where I lived in Costa Rica. It's just very common in Central America when you read the literature about that kind of stuff.
Well, that's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it is. So the gangs are cooperating with the church idea, and the punishment is the gang can then deal with the guy if he's not following the domestic abuse and machismo rules.
Yeah, if he's not sort of living up to the church's rules, absolutely. And again, these are sort of extreme cases. This is in some of the literature in El Salvador and Honduras, but wasn't really the case as far as I knew where I was in Costa Rica. But there's also the fact that because most of these churches are mostly women, a lot of men would sort of fall out of the church and, just never really go back to it. It wasn't impossible to find, your old group of friends and meet back up. So, the church ultimately, it's not like they have an absolute control, especially for new members. But the longer people have been in these organizations, the more these are their friends, and they sort of have come to depend on these people in a way.
Yeah, I wonder how you balance that, because it's a fine line between feeling like you're making these decisions for yourself / you're just being told to do things because, part of I don't know if it's even some sort of masculine ideal or just sort of a human ideal is freedom, right? This idea that you're in control of your own destiny and having other people tell you what to do, must be a bit like, I do what I want. I'm a man. How does that, or does that even exist as a thing? Maybe that's just my own preoccupation. But just how does that exist as a sort of balancing that line between sort of encouraging different behavior? Yeah. At what point does it feel like social control opposed to, actually, I want to do this. This seems like a good idea. I want to do this. I want to change behavior or do X, Y, Z.
I think it may be a function of how long people spend in these organizations to some extent. I'll give an example. I tried to do 10 life history interviews with men from each of these support groups. And then I also did, interviews with men that had never belonged to any of these groups or had joined these groups and then quit. And in those examples, one of the things that came up and one of the things that churches mentioned in funneling men out to these groups is that they can only sometimes, for an unenthusiastic participant, instill these negative the stick, let's say, so much because the man may just leave. He's maybe not that committed to the group, or else he'd be more committed to some of its norms. But I think the problem with that model is that it only pushes so far. And so one of the things that I was more interested in was that these churches, but especially these support groups, had put so much energy into creating alternative, positive models. So it was more of a carrot model, let's say, where they were saying there's all these enticements. The churches have this to some extent. I mean, there's the euphoria that people experience during the praise and worship aspects of services can't be underestimated as a positive, emotional experience that people continue to seek. So the churches, some of them offer that, but these support groups offer more developed. I mean, they're all male support groups, right? So when you go to the church, it's the opposite experience. You feel like you're surrounded by, again, numerically speaking, they're mostly female participants and families that you don't belong to or may not belong to. Whereas in the group, they sort of get a replacement machismo. Like if you go to an AA meeting, let's say, or the WEM is the name of the group I went to that was facilitated by psychologists, and they would carry out different group exercises. They would be able to speak kind of the way they would on the street. They could swear. They didn't consider themselves in mixed company. I mean, the power of of gender segregation in these contexts didn't just hold for men. There were a lot of women's groups that operate on the same principles where, people felt like they were able to, speak freely in the context, not only of their gender peers, but many times of their age peers and their class peers. So, so there's a strong component of that. And that's what I would say ultimately is that, yeah, people want a sense of freedom. They want the idea that they're making these decisions. They're much more likely to feel that way if they feel like there's something positive that they're moving towards rather than a stick that they're moving away from. So I think that was the big struggle that a lot of churches had. And there seemed to be a relationship where men usually belonged to both at one time. The AA group sent them back to, find a church, and, the church would sort of encourage them to continue to do AA or whatever group they belonged to. So that was also a bit of a symbiotic relationship that the church had with another organization outside.
Are you going to these groups, if you're one of these men, are you going to these groups because it's just like something that is just happening in the culture or your community, or are you going to those groups because you have done something pretty shit, like hit a woman or what are the circumstances under which that they are going?
I would say it ranges a bit. This is part of the culture. The same way we have a lot of bromance films. I mean, there's a sign in parts of mass culture, popular culture, where people are seeking out alternative models. So a lot of men are curious. They do enjoy, being with other men, but they don't enjoy being pressured to drink. There's an incredible pressure to drink and to womanize, from certain male groups of friends. So I think that's part of it. Many men are just seeking, but yeah, in many cases, it's because they've done something that they're not proud of. And that really ranges. There's a tolerance in the group, I think, to not judge, because some people have done truly horrible things. And some people, don't want to be afraid to share that the thing they did is not quite as serious, but they still want it taken seriously. So you do talk to men who have basically just like been an annoying husband and been really insecure and got caught checking their wife's phone, and she wanted him to work on it, and he's here and he needs to learn that he's not just here to work on it for her, he's here to work on it for himself. You know what I'm saying? So there's a wide range of reasons that people end up in these groups, but there's also an ideology in the groups that you shouldn't compare severity.
Is that like a common thing in sort of group work, that there's no sort of hierarchy of
Maybe I could kick this back to one of the other people here. Is I've only been to so many support groups in the US, so I don't know quite how that might work here.
Yeah, I don't, I've attended quite a lot of support groups out of, just interest and wanting to know more about, what, because there's 12-step groups for everything, whether it's from overeating or whether it's gambling, so I've attended a whole slew of different types, and there is definitely kind of not a focus on you're not there to kind of slot people into, you're severe, you're mild, you're moderate. Every case,
right.
Ideally, every case is just you have the floor, you get to talk about, your situation. Pretty much how a lot of, support groups run. I mean, for example, if you go to an AA meeting and you want to talk more about, say, your meth use, right? Then they might be like, hey, you might want to go to a different 12-step that focuses on the meth.
Is there a 12-step program to stop yourself going to so many 12-step programs? That's some sort of Fight Club thing.
No, I mean, a lot of people have these challenges, 30 meetings in 30 days or 60 meetings in 30 days.
Okay.
I think you're supposed to go to a meeting as often as you would have abused the drug or committed the behavior that you want to rid yourself of.
Right. There was this book that came out a couple of years ago, Edith, I can't remember her surname, The Choice. She was someone who survived the concentration camps, and then eventually she became a therapist of sorts. And she had this thing about there being there is no hierarchy of suffering. She was comparing clients that one person might have had something seriously messed up happen to them. Another client might come in tears because their bathroom is the wrong shade of yellow or something, And to my mind, I was like, I don't know. I think there is a hierarchy of suffering, but maybe I'm an ignorant and I don't understand. Do you guys have any sort of perspectives on that stuff?
Is it ever helpful in a therapeutic situation to belittle somebody's concerns? No. If a client comes to you and they're very upset about something, it's kind of really not, your place to be like, oh, your concerns are completely irrelevant.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Or that I have more serious issues with other clients to deal with. Why are you wasting my time? Kind of attitude, right? And if you kind of have that thought process, that does carry over in how you approach a client.
Right. But okay, so here's the interesting thing then. So from your sort of professional background, you can have that perspective. But I can imagine in a group setting, it might drive you a bit nuts, right? Because if you're just coming as a regular person off the street and you're sitting with a whole group of other men, and one person, it keeps going on about something that you find inane, I can imagine that must make the group therapy thing really difficult because, you know, the rest of the group isn't professionals. They don't have that sort of perspective or that compassion or empathy or understanding, right?
If you are talking about the subjective assessment of the seriousness of what you've done, people have a very different reaction because in any therapeutic setting, it's not just what happened. It's what did it mean to you? What were the circumstances for you? So some person can be really traumatized by something another person isn't traumatized by. I mean, I have a couple who is a client as a couple. He grew up in a family where his father was a drug addict. His parents fought physically, knives were thrown and so on. And she's outraged that he keeps sort of being angry and saying, fuck this, fuck that. But for him, that's a piece of cake because the behavior has a different meaning to each of them. And if you're in any kind of therapeutic settings, you have to take the subjective experience of what's going on into consideration, whether it's a 12-step program or an individual therapy.
Well, and it's also, 12 steps aren't run by therapists or it is strictly a peer advocacy group. So that's one of the major things that, people do complain about in terms of, oh God, it gets boring or it's, people often complain that like, oh, it's too depressing because people are talking about really tough things or like, it's too depressing because like people aren't talking about serious enough things, right? So you can never really please people everyone in that kind of setting all the time, obviously, and in group therapy, do you run into this issue of where like, a client would be talking about, something that they consider is a deep, grave problem. And another client just kind of like scoffs or berates or just like, makes a minimizing statement like, oh, that's not even a problem,
Part of the therapeutic atmosphere is supposed to be that it is not judgmental, both in therapy and in group therapy, so that whoever is the leader, not a professional, but the leader of the group, should say, look, that everyone's experience is valid. We don't have a chart that states who's relevant and who isn't.
Right. But idealism, whether it's in professional settings or peer group settings or ideals, right? Is that something that always happens in these settings? Not necessarily.
Yeah, I would have thought there's a status as well from being the leader of said group. Which could only feed into the male thing, right? Of being, I'm the man, I'm the leader of this particular group. Like, did you witness any of that sort of stuff, William, or is that just?
Yeah. Well, I would say the ideology of all three groups was pretty formally egalitarian. That we're all equals, and the group that had 3 or 4 therapists. Sometimes this group, it was called WEM, and WEM is an indigenous word that means like. It has to do with masculinity. At the beginning, they would recite something. Somebody would raise their hand and somebody else would call on them and they'd say, well, WEM is, being the best husband, the best son, the best brother, the best. And they would recite all these different things that men can be only in relation, to somebody else. And usually at the end, somebody would joke, and why not? Even the best ex-husband, and everyone would laugh. And there was this strong emphasis that the therapists were just called facilitators. And I would say almost a Christian ethic that like he who wants to be first among you must be last. This idea that the really advanced members of even the most leaderless of the groups, which it might be AA, although their AA meetings had a facilitator that sat at the desk.
Right.
There was, an attitude that like those were the advanced members. They would never belittle somebody. That was like a rookie, mistake to belittle somebody's experience. And they had so much experience that, they were just like elders essentially. And that, I think that's the thing is that definitely like if you're talking about the difference between the ideal and what often happens, that's the way that these missteps where people fail to be egalitarian are experienced. Like, oh, he's having a hard day, or he's new, he doesn't really understand how it works.
But also, these are people. I have one client who went to Sex Abuse Anonymous and then got propositioned by another guy in the parking lot and decided not to go back. But I have other clients who shop around to all the different groups to find one where they feel comfortable. Did people do that there too, or not?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the interesting things. Much like evangelical churches, one of the things that was interesting about comparing, let's say, the churches and then comparing these groups was that the Catholic Church is such an old institution in the region that it's really structurally completely unlike an evangelical church. Yes, there's somebody at the front and they're talking about religion, but yes, often the leaders are men, although not always in some of the evangelical churches. But ultimately, they're very different in the sense that people are voluntarily joining, like forsaking an old identity and joining a new group, which is a much bigger proposition. I mean, not that no one else is doing this. And in some parts of Latin America, many parts, most people going to church on a given Sunday are Protestant and not Catholic, because many Catholics are sort of nominal. They go during holidays or something. But the same is also true of these groups. People would join them completely voluntarily. And as a result, they would fission along these lines. If a group got popular and more people came, then exactly this thing might happen where the more light, members, or that have a different perspective on what their problems were like, that made them want to come, they might split off into a new group, or any number of things can be the cause of one of these fissions. But the same thing happens with churches. Essentially, as they grow and they gain members, these divisions become more significant, and you have a bigger camp of people that feel the same way that you do. So I saw that a lot. And I think in the AA ideology in that area, that's considered sort of ideal, that a group that's too big, you can't really get to know everyone that well. And you can't really have that be a social network that feels as intimate as a smaller group might, so that 12 is kind of considered the ideal size. The same thing is said about Bible study groups and many of these other forms of voluntary organization where people just agree that, sometimes it's better to break.
Are these organizations co-ed?
This is actually the great question, and I'm so glad you asked that, because I'm embarrassed I haven't put it more forthrightly. But in Latin America, not all places, but in Latin America, they're almost all gender segregated. And so people have argued that, unlike base communities, let's say, Catholic base communities, these are gender segregated. In fact, there's a lot of all-women groups. In Latin America, many parts, Al-Anon has become the de facto women's AA. Because initially men's drinking was like this. You'd walk down the street on the way home, somebody'd say, hey, have a shot with us. You'd say, no, I can't. And they would pressure you and you'd have to have a shot with them. And then it would turn into 5 shots or whatever, This would happen a lot. Whereas women's drinking was often like in these patriarchal households, within the house, private, alone, the kind of way that we in Protestant cultures think of drinking, being by yourself in your house, like having a problem drinking. That was actually the way women's drinking was often experienced. Men's drinking was more often a public, drinking and drunkenness. It was shameful to the family because it was seen by everybody in this way. So the drinking was very different, and this has continued with other support groups. There are lots of all-women support groups, aside from Al-Anon. There's actually an interesting support group, a 12-step group called Neuroticos Anonymous, and they don't use the feminine form because technically these groups can't be gender segregated, but in fact they all are almost. And this is women who, I guess if you translate it, neurotics anonymous, it's women who experience themselves as having nerve issues and
like anxiety.
Yeah, so it ranges from the acute experience that's called nervios to ataque de nervios, like the attack, a nervous attack, or susto, like if you get suddenly scared or freaked out by something. But all these women experiencing any of these symptoms could go. But yeah, it's on a moment-to-moment basis. It's people that would experience themselves as being very anxious.
Right.
A lot of the Bible study groups likewise were gender segregated. And there was a sense that people gave that you could speak more freely in these contexts, that whether it was because people had been socialized or whatever, people felt that in mixed gender groups, you may not be able to. I did have a therapist, the main therapist I knew in this group, that told me that he felt like it was stronger for men than for women, because he said, when I have been at this women's group, he was one of the few like openly gay men that I knew in town, and he said, when I run this women's group, I don't know if it's because I'm gay or whatever, but people just, they don't treat me any differently when I'm there. And I've even had men come, and the women acknowledge the men, but then they just go right on with the group, like the man has not interrupted them. But he said, by contrast, I tried to have my female colleague come by this men's group, and we tried to run group as normal, and it did not work. He said the men valued maybe even especially more the idea of being not in mixed company.
Wow.
Yeah, that makes
it's
sense.
male bonding by meeting instead of by drinking or doing drugs or something. Makes sense. Sorry, Koi, I interrupted you.
Why does it make sense?
I think there is a general social tendency. Like, for example, I ran a sexual health group at my rehab, and it's called sexual health and recovery. Since our facility had a lot of men, I remember the first time I ran group as a woman, because it was one of those topics, and it was one of those groups that a lot of counselors didn't like leading. A lot of people in the therapy sector of our facility were often the ones that ran it. But I remember running it for the first time, and a couple of the newer guys kind of being really anxious and having this nervous laugh about oh, I thought a guy was running this group. I think there's kind of this, pervasive social sense that that exist much more in men, where this would be offensive to women, or expressing these things would be offensive to women, that women have more delicate, right?
Oh, right. Yeah. I was going to say, I had imagined that also part of the factor would be being vulnerable in front of a woman maybe is a bit more difficult.
Definitely.
Opposed to it being offensive, because I'm, if you can punch a woman in the face, it would be bizarre that you would be worried about offending them.
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily offending women, but that this language aren't for ladies.
Yeah.
This topic is, generally speaking, for example, if you're talking about something, about sexuality. Actually, if that's the topic, then that often tends to be a very gender segregated topic, where both, genders are we would like to separate. Because a lot of women, the sexual health and recovery used to be a mixed gender. And during my time in tenure at my facility, it became separate because of, client request. Oftentimes, sometimes we would, bring everyone together and do mixed groups if we were doing some kind of broad topic like sexually transmitted infections or something like that, where it's just it's good to just get everyone together because it's more of an informative rather than a discussion type group. But yeah, eventually, actually, we split the group up into 3. I don't know if that even, if how that's being done at the facility now, but the one of the male therapists ended up taking over the men's sexual health recovery group, and then I ended up doing the women and the trans intersex group. So we had 3. Yeah, trans and non-gender binary. So we had a group for that as well.
I think that's also, I've read literature both in the U.S. and Latino communities and in Latin America, that in big enough cities, a lot of these AA groups have LGBT specific.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's tons of there's quite a lot of AA groups that are LGBT specific, and a lot of times they run, one group will be mostly lesbians, another group will be mostly gay men, some group will be mixed. But
is the idea then that if there's a sort of an in-group and an out-group, in having same type of person in the group, is the idea that through just hanging out with the in-group, that there's a sort of sense of collective healing that allows you to then go out into the world?
What you're saying is sort of hitting on something, which I think is, on the one hand, there is a very strong sense of these being places where people, in churches, they'd say stuff like, oh, you're a baby Christian. There's a developmentalist sort of language and metaphor of looking at you like growing up. And they would talk this way a little bit in some of these support groups, that people considered it a point of pride how often or how long they'd been there. Unlike the like formal AA rule where if you drink once, you have to start over. I don't know if they all formally held to that, and in the other two groups that it definitely wasn't, and you could miss a group or whatever, and you could have a relapse, but they mostly counted the number of meetings you'd attended. So there is a bit of a preference towards seniority, but also this general idea that you go from here, you gain strength, and you also develop in your earlier stages, and then you carry this out into the world. And maybe initially too, what you're describing, there is just maybe a wider cultural acknowledgement of gender segregation as allowing certain kinds of sociality, or it only being appropriate to have certain kinds of sociality in certain non-mixed settings. But having said that, I think the language increasingly becomes more positive, where it's less about who's not in the group, at least in its emphasis, and more about the strength of this identification. Like not only are we alcoholics, but we're all LGBTQ alcoholics. Like the more things you have in common with somebody, you don't have to have everything in common with them. And people take pride in being able to identify across these lines as well, but especially as they become more advanced. But often, the whole model of sponsorship, is that you can see an older version of yourself as somebody that could identify with your particular concerns. And there is a strong, it's almost like Aristotelian, like if you read Nicomachean Ethics, it's like you find a true friend, a virtuous friend, that will sort of keep you, focused on being ethical. And so there's an idea more this positive of like identifying, like the real talent is learning to see yourself in others, like learning to see that you're not this isolated autonomous unit that thinks it can make its own decision. It has clearly failed to do that, but you're a part of a bigger group and a bigger whole. And if you can learn to see yourself in others, then you can learn to have empathy for others. Then you can learn to not make decisions that are going to hurt others, this kind of thing.
Well, I do think that one of the differences here between men and women, and here gays have an advantage too, is women have many more permissions to emotionally bond. Women bond with their children, they bond with other women, they bond with relatives. A lot of male bonding depends on who they're having sex with, that they feel they could be vulnerable with, and they don't have a male group where they can be vulnerable. So I think I can see why they would want male gender only meetings, because it's having permission to have a protective male, a father type person, and a protective male environment, where most male environments are not protective and they don't allow you to be vulnerable. And that is much worse for men than it is for women, which is why, they're 4 times, at least in the US, 4 times more likely to commit suicide. And they're the ones shooting everybody every day.
Yeah, and it's like
they're desperate.
The guests we had recently, the 2 ex-prisoners.
Yeah.
One of the things he was saying is, part of the reason you might end up in that situation is just that you were carrying too much for one person to carry. And yeah, it goes hand in hand with the sort of restrictive nature that a lot of the sort of macho stuff requires you to be or perform is sort of locked off, shut down. Yeah, it's true that there's a lack of communication or vulnerability with your group. And it's also the reason why you need a positive version of, it's not even like a positive version of masculinity necessarily. It's just like a positive version of something, some sort of sense of empowerment or in your own identity.
I think it's also a positive identification with empathy for other beings and yourself, because men are much more trained not to be emotionally empathetic or sweet to other people or protective in any kind of an emotional way, or to recognize their own feelings. And so if you're a man, to be in an all-male group that recognizes feelings is a new and important bonding experience.
Yeah, the key phrase William had there was to see yourself in others. I thought was, That's brilliant.
Yeah, it's very important because I think in a macho culture, even more than ours, which has deep pockets of machismo but not as strong, is the lack of emotional permission for vulnerability, and all male groups that allow you to be vulnerable and recognize your joint vulnerability are enormously important for men.
Ikoi, have you seen some of that sort of stuff happen in any of the groups that you've been part of?
I mean, I think definitely, whether you're talking about AA or I think, overeating or codependence or even like anger management or, emotional regulation and domestic violence groups, a lot of times ultimately like you are less talking about the problem and ultimately mostly talking about your relationship, whether it's your relationship with that activity and how that usually translates back to, the conditions that you grew up in and the relationships with, people in your life, of how they impact behavior. But we are a society where men don't talk about how they relate to people. We are in many ways still a gender segregated society.
Yes.
And that, men are socialized very differently from
Yes.
women in some ways. And that becomes, and culturally that can have some really strong elements at play. So it's one of those things where, I think generally speaking, right, a lot of times, because, when people think about like for a sexual health group, for example, again, like you're really not talking about the sexual act the vast majority of the time. Like that can come into the picture, but a lot of times you're talking about like what that means for you, what that looks like in a bigger picture. And, you do have situations where, like that was a huge part of why these groups became kind of segregated. One, because like, the number of women were like basically 3-to-1 ratio. At our facility, 3 men to every woman. So they felt outnumbered. But, a lot of times they were just like, I can't relate to this, or I can't relate to some of the male experience. I mean, they're like, it's interesting, but it's not something that like I can directly relate to. And we would much prefer our own space where we can talk more about relationships that we can relate to. I mean, and I think that's also a difference between like, a fairly large number of women at our facility were like heterosexual or had a lot of heterosexual experience versus like a lot of the men at our facility were gay men. So, because there are, I mean, some of the more interesting kind of like exceptions to that kind of dynamic. I remember a straight guy that was at our facility was just like, hey, like, would it be okay if I joined the women's group? For the same reason, he was just like, I just can't relate to these experiences.
Right.
Be as a heterosexual. And right now, like most of the women in your group are heterosexual. So maybe I might be able to relate more there. Or like, there were a couple of more monogamous gay men that were like, oh, like maybe the women's group would fit better for me because my experiences is an exception to the group.
Right.
As a monogamous man. And also just like there were just couple of men that were like, we're men, but we were mostly socialized around women. I only had women friends. I still only mostly have close women friends. So can I hang out with the ladies?
The women's group.
Yeah, because that's how I've been socialized. I'm much more comfortable talking to women than around men. So, there can be like a lot of individual exceptions in these kinds of things. But as a general rule, I mean, even doing groups, it's when I have been working with like a lot of gay men versus like, versus straight women versus, straight women and, gay women tended to not have much friction in terms of I can't relate to you guys. They tended to be a lot less. There were a lot less of that between the two groups. They tended to discuss, relational issues very well together.
2 reflections. One is in the wonderful book Dreams from the Monster Factory by Susie Schwartz about her rearrangement of a prison. Everyone had to be in therapy, and they found that the therapy groups worked best when they were gender-only therapy groups, because the women who were in prison were usually accompanying or facilitating a violent offender who was male, whereas the men were perpetrating the violence and needed to talk about their role as accomplices and lacking any kind of personal fortitude to say no, whereas the men were more violent and domineering, and they wanted to divide them. And it worked so well. It reduced recidivism 75%, this way of organizing prisons. So of course it was dropped. But I think women do tend to value intimacy and to have a much easier time with intimate conversations. I can have a more intimate conversation about the way I look, the way I feel with some woman who happens to be putting on makeup in the bathroom, women's room next to me, than my husband has with some of his close friends. Because there's this automatic bonding. Often the leaven that makes that friendship rise is that men are difficult, but there is this bonding that men don't have and desperately need.
And that's socialized, you think? Like
yes.
men could be in the bathroom together comparing clothes or something, but they don't.
Yes, of course they could. How do I look? Do I look fat? They never ask each other that.
Yeah, or if you dared ask that, you would definitely not get a complimentary answer.
No.
Yeah, it's funny. Like a couple of years ago, I went to this. They had this festival in London. They call it a festival. It's a couple of days thing. The South Bank Centre. It's a cultural sort of hotspot, I guess, in London. And it was the Being a Man festival. And in the back of my head, I was like, yeah, a real man wouldn't go to a festival about how to be a real man. But I thought that was kind of funny. So I was like, yeah, I'll go along. And they had all these kind of talks, and it was quite interesting. But they also had this sort of informal, I guess it had parallels maybe with some of these types of meetings you've been talking about. Just a bunch of guys got together and sat in a circle, and they had like one guy who was, I guess, a professional of some sorts, and people were just encouraged to talk about anything that they were going through or various problems that they faced being a man. Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting, and it had a parallel with years ago I made a documentary, a very short one, about the Occupy movement that was happening in Bristol when I lived there. And there was this vibe of like, oh yeah, these kind of spaces to just have conversations about stuff just don't sort of exist in everyday life. You can go down the pub maybe and chat to some people, but maybe, generally speaking, if you're going down the pub, it's probably with some friends already, and conversation might be limited to what your friendship group maybe normally talks about, certain subjects. Whereas this getting together with a bunch of strangers, whether it was Occupy or just in this sort of forum, was really interesting. It was really sort of like a different space that doesn't exist in other parts of life. And that felt like a bit of it was eye-opening, and it was also kind of sad that didn't exist as a sort of general cultural thing, because Can
I ask a question?
Go for it.
Do you feel like it was because of the organization of the way, the specific rules of the organization, that the group is so different that you're describing, the Occupy groups, for instance?
It was the ability to get together with a complete bunch of strangers and be able to talk about, various different subjects in a forum that was designed for that. And it felt very much like, oh, this just doesn't exist in my life. And that felt like, I think this is maybe similar with a lot of people's experience with Occupy, was that it was, it cracked something open for a lot of people. Like, oh shit, there's maybe alternative ways of doing things. Yeah, I don't know if I really have a point other than just like that felt like something by and large positive. Like I said, in these group situations, it could be that more often than not, someone would talk a lot more than the other people, and it could get a bit whatever. But it was still refreshing.
Yeah, and rare
because,
in men's experience. Sorry, Clay.
Oh, no. And I was just going to say, like, the one aspect of, one thing that people have an extremely hard time discussing is, economic distress of not being able to financially support yourself. And because that's just, a topic that a lot of people have a lot of just like socially ingrained inbuilt shame about talking about, right? Especially like, if you come from somewhat of a middle class background and you're doing the economic slide down below that. And I think one of the things that was, different about the Occupy movement versus a lot of all these like other support groups was from the things that I've heard from a couple of people that you could express, economic distress.
Yes. It was a class-based movement, 1%, 99%.
Right. Versus like, that you can talk about your financial difficulties and that's an extraordinarily difficult thing for people to talk about in general.
I think it's more men than women because men have been assigned in the gender bifurcation, they've been assigned the role of being providers, which they can't be, and are often humiliated by that. Whereas women haven't been self-designed as providers. And so if they can't provide, it's less humiliating.
It's less humiliating, but at the same time, one of the things that I really got an impression of throughout my life was that, like, as a woman, if you are not married to a good provider, that's because you're not that good of a woman.
Right. That you haven't made good choices or something like that.
So there's still a lot of shame in that.
Well, there's definitely something shifting as well, though, now, which is like there's this idea of maybe that the house husband is sort of a desirable thing, right? Like the lady will be out leaning in, making all the money, and the guy can stay home and look after the kids, right? So that sort of... And I guess maybe it's a minority opinion, at least at the minute. But it's one of those things where there's this thing of like, on one hand, you don't want, as a lady, this is the impression I get. You tell me, because I'm just maybe verging into the dangerous territory of mansplaining. But there's this idea that, like, on one hand, you don't want some bum partner who's just sitting at home doing nothing, but on the other hand, there's this advantage of like, well, I can go off and make all the money and do advance my career, and they can stay home and look after the kids. So there's this sort of switch, and so there seems to be a lot of tension there potentially, because it's like, what, I'm going to be sort of emasculated by being a house husband or something like that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, because I know a divorce lawyer, and he is now representing several divorces where the men have stayed. I mean, like, it's kind of like the classic men have stayed home, taking care of the kids. It's like classic role reversal. The women have gone on to, very highly lucrative and successful careers. And once the kids were out of the house, they have been now replaced with a younger, handsome.
That's cute.
And now they have, the men are just like, hey, like, I spent, I basically gave up, my potential career to, provide for my family in this way. And it's basically very, very classic role reversal in some ways, right?
It is, because there's only 39% of couples where that exists, and in those arrangements, the women do most of the housework to make the men feel better. Now, that doesn't include who's going to stay home and watch the children, but they actually do more domestic work. I also should point out that because of that bad choices model, blue-collar men have an awfully hard time finding a wife, and the majority of women in America is now single. And the majority of people refusing marriage are now women, because men can't support women. and women are still expected to do all the housework and childcare, and the man doesn't bring in enough money to give them a reasonable time to do that. And so it's breaking down.
Yeah, the tricky thing is it depends what you value, right? Like if you just value career aspirations and money, then, you know, whatever. But it's like if you actually value someone's ability to care, as in care for children, then it doesn't matter if they're not at work. Like if they can look after children, then that's something, right? But and also from the male perspective, it's like if you have a problem with the idea of cleaning, you know, therein lies, you know, a whole conversation there. It's like, well, what's wrong with cleaning? Like, what's wrong with doing housework? Why is that a problem?
I took some pictures when I was there in the churches, and one of the big things that the men's group would do would be like cook breakfast in this evangelical church for after the service. The service was very long. There was like an hour and a half of praise and worship music before the service proper even began.
Wow.
And,
wow. That
but
is
one of the
long.
things you'd see is like these men, you know, over there as the service was ending in this other part of the building, you know, chopping up onions and with aprons on and joking. And they take all these kind of joking pictures with me, but there was a real, I guess that's what I'm saying. There's a positive learning experience that has to take place. It's like men need institutions to learn how to do, you know, I follow this funny, you know, Zoomer Instagram site, poster called Boys Who Can Cook, that involves, you know, young men like going out into the world not knowing how to cook, you know, and then doing a very bad job. You know, it's satire, you know, based around the fact that they can't. But there is a way where it's like, that's also kind of sad because it's not like they'd be incapable of knowing how to cook, you know, or that they might not enjoy it. I am actually in this position. My wife is tenured and about to go for a full professor at CSU San Marcos. And until I got this recent postdoc, this research position, I've been working part-time here at Mira Costa and doing a lot of, you know, plus with the pandemic, you know, doing a lot of the child care and the home care and I'm a bit of a homebody and maybe a little, you know, of my own sort of bird this way. So I've always liked, you know, sitting around the house and doing chores and stuff like that. And I like my teaching that I do at Mira Costa. So I didn't particularly mind, but you know, you don't just live in a vacuum. I mean, culturally speaking, all of what you're saying is true. You know, people don't always have a very high opinion of it, in men or women. You know, the attitude. I'm sure a lot of women aren't feeling like, oh, I clean because it's you know, the zen of cleaning. It's they clean because they feel like it should be cleaned, and you know, and men aren't doing it. But
yeah, well, it is debased. It's devalued. You know, a parking lot attendant in the United States who works full time gets more than a daycare worker who's watching children full time every day.
Right.
And,
well, yeah, I mean, that mostly I think comes from tips.
well, maybe it comes from tips, whatever it comes from. People who watch children get less, and doing cleaning, you know, home health care aides get paid terribly. And because what was traditionally women's work has been devalued. There are attempts to change it, like Jacinda Ardern translated caring work into the tasks that are well paid outside of that labor. And all the caring laborers, from social workers who take care of people and therapists to nurses, aides, and daycare workers, got a 30.5% increase. But that was a very daring and unusual move on her part. And so that part of the problem is men don't want to do it because they feel they're devalued, because the society devalues those things.
Exactly. I mean, that's what I found in common about the religious settings that I studied in these three support groups. Is what they were doing was a kind of a transvaluation. They were inverting values. You know, they were sort of saying, one of the things that I saw them doing symbolically is that masculinity is identified with there's an active passive dichotomy in a lot of Western history, but it persists in a lot of Latin America. And and in Latin America also, despite the fact that the men run the major churches, obviously, spirituality is sort of coded feminine. Not just the Marian imagery, but male priests, either hypocrites or abnormal, is the way that one famous scholar in Brazil put it in the 50s. That it was not considered, it was considered to somehow violate the secularity, or at least the anti-clerical, attitudes that men largely had, even men that were on the conservative side of the 19th century wars, and supported the Catholic Church very strongly as an institution, would hold anti-clerical attitudes a lot of times towards individual priests and stuff. So it's a thing in Latin America where it might have been a little bit different in the States, where religion is sort of codified as female or feminine, and that's one of the things that was going on in these groups and in the churches, was that it was making it seem possible to be masculine and spiritual. And they did that by reframing spirituality as an active process of growth and development, and therefore justifiably and visibly masculine, by the other cultural norms that define masculinity. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was really interesting when I sort of figured out, like, that's kind of like they're doing a lot of stuff, these inversions of the men cooking here and making coffee for each other and doing all this like domestic labor for each other in these groups, and in these churches. And part of it is that they have there's an older image of spirituality as like long suffering, sort of like being a martyr, sort of tolerating all the things that are, and therefore it fits into this Marian imagery of the long suffering woman. But by
and Jesus
portraying
on the cross.
Right, exactly. But by portraying it as like a struggle, that's the way I heard it talked about the most in these groups, in these churches, as like an active struggle. They were able to code it as something that was identifiably masculine. I called it, kind of Jacobean, image of spirituality. But they, because it also has to do with this growth and development imagery. So right. I don't want to compare it to muscular Christianity in the 19th century, in the United States, but there are these recurrent things where these movements of trying to, make a space for men in churches and in spiritual movements, and how you do that symbolically,
Right, because there is a similar movement, at least I'm mostly familiar with this within evangelical circles of similar in the United States, about like, men are about, caring for their community and families and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Did you see any kind of difference between like the Catholic groups versus the evangelical groups, or were they relatively similar?
Well, I think in the area where I was, there's a strong Franciscan contingency locally. Not that the Franciscans dominate the parish or anything, right. But I do think that softens things a little bit. I don't know how to explain that really theologically. I mean, other than to sort of suggest it. But I would say that they hewed a sort of middle of the road. I never heard, the Catholic priest had to be careful not to say anything that violated church teaching on the proper relationship in a marriage.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they never said anything like overtly, that a lot of people might consider like backwards or something. They never said, woman's job is just to, it was never like that. I think in the evangelical churches, because they're not run centrally, you just have a lot more variation in both directions. You both have evangelical churches where women are essentially running them, like that exists in some places, as well as evangelical and Pentecostal, neo-Pentecostal churches where there's very much an image of like female submission. I mean, complementary at best, So there's a wide range. I would say on the whole, the evangelicals maybe range a little more traditionalist and complementarian, like if you're talking about the people attending the churches, but if you're talking about the message from the pulpits, I guess that's different,
Now I'm going to have to go at 2:30 and it's 2:28. So I just want to thank you and thank Coy, and thank you as well. Thank the speaker for your insights and bringing up this topic.
Well, thanks, Harry. It was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. And I think it's great that they're addressing these things, because they're huge problems. And men are in trouble in the United States on a level that women aren't. They fill the prisons. They're murdering people every day. They're committing suicide a whole lot more than they certainly could do with some of the programs that seem to be happening in Latin America. I'm really glad you came. Thank you.
Thanks. It was so nice to meet you.
You can listen to part 2 of this conversation on Patreon right now, or if you just wait 1 week, we'll release it for free. Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Bruce Rogers-Vaughan, Alexander Lashley, Sheena Belmas, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, Alexandra McCormick, and Wig Shaker.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And if you want to hear even more from Harriet, check out her radio show, Interpersonal Update, on WBAI and in the WBAI archives.